Hello and welcome. Looks like my camera is not working again. I just have to take it out, put it back in. I'm not sure what the deal is there. It's making me crazy. Guess nobody wants to see my face. That's okay. It's always big too. It's like, come on. All right, let's get down. There we go. That's better. Okay, well, welcome to another edition of DBADuck, DBATools / PowerShell office hours. We don't have any questions in PoleGab, so if there's any questions in the audience, that's great to let me know. I've been playing a little bit with the DBA tool side of write-DBA table data. And the unfortunate side of the scenario there is that it doesn't always work like I want it to. And it should work better. We're going to update Azure Data Studio while we talk. But basically the principle is that it really should act a little bit more friendly, and it isn't seeming to. But I wanted to go back and behind the scenes and just illustrate some of the things that can happen. And hopefully we can get some bugs filed or some things that to actually act a little bit better for this. And then we're going to go over one of the other tools I use a lot and just give you an idea of how that works. It's a tool that works wonders on log files, and a lot of people don't do a whole lot of log file management today, at least in the consulting I've seen. Sometimes the log file is not necessarily a first-class citizen, and it really should be, because logs mean a lot to the database. If you don't have a good log, then you are in trouble with a lot of things. So I want to go over that function as well as part of today's fun. Just a second here. There we go. All right, so we're good here. Let me pull up the code for it, because there is a, let's do a DBAtools.io, go to docs, and then go into our write-DBA table data. Docs, there we go. Write. There's not that many write functions, but write that, okay. DBA, there we go. So in the write-DBA table data, you have options to put in some things. So keep nulls, truncate, keep identity fire triggers, no tab lock, table, database, blah, blah, blah. So it's really kind of handy to have, because what it does is it basically takes the data you have in the input object, which is a data table potentially. In this case, they import CSV. Data table, then you specify the data table. They do allow you to specify the whole table without doing a dash schema, which is nice because it keeps you from having to do too many parameters. But basically it performs a bulk insert of all the data. Now the challenge comes when you already have a table. So we're going to show that here, and then we're going to go into the code. So we're going to click into the code here and just make sure you see. So let's do this. Let's exit out of here, exit out of here, exit out of here. And we're going to just do a new query here. And we're going to go into the demo database, demo2 database. And we're just going to create a table. And it's going to be very simple. So create DBODB ben demo1. And in it, we're going to have an ID that has an int. And we're going to have a name that has a varchar 50. Okay. Pretty simple. No primary key, just a table. Okay, so we're good there. Now we're going to go out here and we're going to create us a table or data. So we're going to say the data is going to be, let's do a notepad. Notepad here. Whoops, that's not notepad. Notepad here, we're going to say notepad, and we're going to say ID, comma name, and then we're going to do 1, comma Ben, and 2, comma George, and we're going to save it. So let's save this out as C demos. test.csv. Save that out as that. We'll grab the file name here, save it, exit, and we're going to use that. So data table equals import CSV. Path is this guy here. Then we're going to do the same thing they did, right? Dash DB table data, SQL instance, and we will do one thing or more because this won't have the the get module will not have DBATools run, and we have DBATools 2.0. So we're going to do one more thing too. So prod dash SQL 1. Let's make sure that prod says dash SQL 1. Yep, dash SQL 1 backslash SQL 01. The database is going to be demo 2, and the table is going to be DBO dot whatever I called it, Ben demo 1. Ben demo 1. Okay, and the input object is going to be obviously the data table, which in this case is simply an import CSV, which again it converts it into a data table for you. Whether that's good or bad, that's not what we're talking about today. We're just going to talk about how it works. So if I were to run this, that runs just fine. Okay, so we get a table. And if I were to run this, we'll get an error. And that's okay for now because we're going to fix that error. That error, it's running and running. Wow, that's kind of crazy. Prod SQL 1, SQL 01. Let's make sure I didn't do it wrong. Prod dash SQL 1, SQL 01. Okay. So for some reason this is, oh, do I not? It said it worked. Now we're going to go in here and we're going to grab the table. Ben demo 1, select. Okay, the data's in there. Okay, so that simple example works great. Now, when things happen with lots of other columns, it gives you an error about not being able to map the columns. Okay, so weird enough, if I were to create a, let me alter this database or this table and add a column. Ben demo 1. And watch it not work now because I'm doing this. Add, and we're just going to add one called Ben Miller is the column name, and the type is varchar 50. All right, we're going to add that. And now I have a column called Ben Miller, and we're going to modify this little text file. So test CSV, we're going to edit open with Notepad, and we're going to add a column. So here's the column, and we're going to call it Bob. So the column name is Ben Miller, but I'm going to call it Bob, and we're going to put last names on these guys. Junior. Okay, save it. Go back in here. We'll do the import again. So let's import this text again. So we just have a new data table. We can see that data table here has 3 columns, but one's named Bob, and we know the table name has Ben Miller as the column name. Okay, so if I were to right click and do select star, you'll see that I have Ben Miller in their nulls. Okay, so now we're going to add these columns back. Now again, we didn't put a primary key, so we won't have a conflict, but we do have an extra column. The reason I thought we were going to get an error on this particular stint is because this is 2.0. So if I go down here and do get module, we remember that there is 2.0, and 2.0 requires a trust server certificate. My guess is that we have get-DBATools config, and I have it set to be true on the trust server certificate here by default. And we'll see in just a second when it gets done right here. And it is true, so that's why I didn't get an error. I was expecting to have to do that. So what I was going to do is take this guy and just for this session, say set-DBATools config with full name equals this and value equals true, and then run that. I wasn't going to persist it. This is persisted because I went out, went back in. So I must have done a register DBATools config, which is fine because that's what we do. but it already is set, so I didn't have to do this. So that's the error I expected to get. Now I have this new data table, and I'm going to run this and watch what happens. It tells me an error because it shouldn't do this, in my opinion. I'm not the author of that function. But what I found odd is that I can actually do this with the SQL Server module, and it works just fine. Because there's one principle that exists in the SQL bulk copy object we talked about a long time ago. The bulk copy object allows you to not have to have a column map. And the column map is just a way to say this column in the source is this column in the destination. This column in the source is this column in the destination. What I wanted to attempt to tell you in this case is because I do down and dirties all the time with just stuffing things in tables. And I have table schema, but here's the problem. This table schema, if I were to push the data in, I get, I don't have a table that way. I would get this thing if I were to say Ben demo 2 and then just say auto create table. If I were to execute this, it would create the table. But I don't like the idea that when I get done, I have a Ben demo 2 and I have nvarchar maxes as my strings. Even the ID that was an int was an nvarchar max. Not cool. In my opinion, not cool. So what I expected to be able to happen, and this is what I ran into and I ended up using a different way, is that I shouldn't have to specify a column map. Now, much to my chagrin, I went out to DBATools, went out here and said, oh, let me look at this in the source code. So I'm opening up the source code. And the source code comes in and says this. When I go down in here, it doesn't say that I have to write -DBA table data with a map. Now, this also doesn't say that my columns names have to match my data set. So I was lulled into a false sense of security, and that's fine. But when I came down here, what I expected to see how there's this data map right here, column map, hash table. I'll show you that in a minute. So I come down in here and I say, I want to have this guy running. And all it does is check to see if you've specified a database. If so, then it does this. Otherwise, it gets, whoops, let me get that out of there. Wow, that's weird. It selects the DB name as the DB name and gives you the database name for the database. So you don't have to specify a database per se. You should, because you're going in there. But then it goes down here and says invoke bulk copy. So here's a function inside a function. And basically it takes the bulk copy object that gets created, that gets passed in. Now, here's where the magic happens. Down here in the bottom, it has a, come on, doesn't like the Azure SQL database. This is a lot of stuff that is trying to help you not blow up your options here. But the biggest thing down here just basically says, here's your bulk copy options and your context. Stop. I don't know why it does that. Oh, it's GitHub. That's why. But what it wants is if you didn't specify a column map, which is right down here. Let's just do column map. Column map. Oh, come on. Map. So there's one there, one here, showing a column map. There's my parameter. Then comes down and says, if there is a column map, then map each column. Each column in column map, map in here, bulk copy mappings, add key column name. Great. Else, if the column map doesn't exist, look at that. It just takes the prop in the columns column name of the data table, and it says map, it has a map. I don't want a map. This is property name to property name. Well, that means that I have to have the same property names. I have to have the same property names as I have column names. And that breaks the code, which you can see in Azure Data Studio. It tells me failed to bulk insert because you have the column mapping is messed up. But I didn't want a column mapping. I didn't care. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back here and we're going to do a column map. Okay, column map equals hash table. Okay, the hash table says ID equals ID. Okay, and then I'm going to say name equals name. And Bob equals Ben Miller. Okay, there's my column map. So I've mapped my ID to ID and my name to my name and Bob to Ben Miller. Say, we're going to put that in memory. And now we're going to do this again. So copy this down here. We're going to put a column map in there. Column map is column map. All right, now we're going to run this. And it still comes up and says I'm screwed. Now let's do this in demo 1 because that's where I added the column to that. And it comes back and still says the column mapping doesn't match. So even though I added a column map, and we're going to do it backwards because this is one thing I didn't test. So let's do this. Just for the sake we're on Twitch, we're going to backwards them. So name and name and name and let me make sure that that's the column name. So ID, name, and Bob. Yep, so we're good. I'm going to reverse them and say Ben Miller equals Bob. Because I didn't try this. I don't know why I didn't try it, but I could have it backwards in my tests and that could have frustrated me. And it still didn't. So even though I put a column map in, it didn't like me. My column map is here, column map. And it comes up and says, here's my columns, right? Now I went and looked in the code. And the column map says, give me the key, which is going to be ID. And then the column name key. So my column name is the column name from the column map. Okay? Okay, that's fair. But for some reason, that bulk copy object does not love me at all, and it still gives me these errors that we don't like. Failed to bulk import. So 2 flaws that we need to have fixed. But I ran this many times and tried to get this to work many times, and unfortunately, it requires a column map. But even when you put a column map in, it doesn't work. So that is not cool. Okay? It's not cool at all. So we need to make sure that I need to make sure that I go and bug this because it should just work. It used to work so fantastic, but lately I've used it and I've had to basically I've had to auto create table. The bummer is when I auto create table, it auto creates it in the exact proper way. And that's another thing I didn't test. So while we're on Twitch, we're going to do this. We're going to say a column map is there, and we're just going to auto create table. And it still doesn't let me auto create the table. So frustration abounds. Okay, so that's not happy. But I wanted you to see why it wasn't happy in case you run into this as well. I'm going to see if I can't work with the developer and see if we can't fix this thing, because that should not be the case. We should not automatically have a column map. It should just happen. Because you saw when we did the tests a ways back when we used SQL bulk copy to pull data down and put it in the table, we didn't have a column map. And SQL bulk copy doesn't require a column map, and then it does ordinal based. So I can have call 1, call 2, call 3, call 4, call 5 in bulk copy, and it will look for 5 columns, right? Column 1 through 5, and it'll just put the data in column 1 in the first column, column 2 in the second column. I don't need a column map. You just need to shove the data in. That's down and dirty, fire hose, put. So didn't work, bummer. So that's not very fun. All right, so that's enough of that one. The other one I wanted to show was the expand DBA log file. So if you've ever done that one, hopefully you've seen it run a time or two. But this has helped me a ton because it's only one expand column. It's one expand function, and it helps you to expand the log file the way you want. So those of you who know log files in SQL know that if you were go into a database and you were to say, let's do the wide world importers new. Come in here and we say dbcc log info. Now, there's another one in 2016 and above that says select star from sysdmdb, db log info. It said log info, so it's cute that we have dbcc log info and we have a log info here. The difference is we have to specify a database ID for the log info function. So it's a DMF. So if we do log info here, we see log info, okay? So it's nice and pretty. Here's our offsets. Here's our file sequence numbers, which they all have. There's our parity. And here's whether they're used, right? And let's create LSN. This database hasn't had anything created, okay? And that's fine. We'll show you that in a second. The bigger deal is I get the same thing here, except notice in this result, I see file size and it's bytes. Bytes today don't really help us much. The log info one from sysdmdb log info now tells me it in megabytes. So it's nice and helpful. Shows me that it's 12.43 megabytes, which is not anywhere close to 512, which is, somewhat of an ideal size. But it's important to understand that the create LSN is still 0, just in a little different format. And then the encrypt your thumbprint. If you have a database that's encrypted, this encrypt your thumbprint will show up, which does not show up in dbcc log info. But the crux of it is if I expanded this log, so let's go into here, and we're going to the DW. We're going to expand the log file by 50 meg, so 150. And we'll say okay. We go in here and we look at the log info here and watch what happened. You get a 50 meg log VLF because it was so small, right? It was smaller than it should be, but it only created one. So we're going to do it again. Okay, so we're going to go in here, go here, and we're going to create one of 200. Run fast log info. Now we have two 50 meg logs. Well, if we want 500, typically what you might do is you might right click, do properties, and then do files, and then say 8000 or 8192 after 2016, so 8000. You'll get an 8 meg VLF or 8 gig VLF. Now it should run decently fast, but we're going to watch the DBCC log info or log info from the DMDB, and you're going to see that we get different sizes. Now 8 gig should give us 16 VLFs, so we should end up with 26 VLFs. Okay, so let's go see if we do. And of course we do. Okay, so they're all 487 meg, and that's closer to 512, right? But often you'll get lots of VLFs like this, especially if you have auto grow at 64K or 64 meg, or if you have a log growth of percentage, you'll get these weird ones over the smaller ones and then weird ones. So that's kind of weird. So to fix that, you would go like this: tasks, shrink, files. I want my log shrunk, so I'm going to shrink it just down to just nothing. Let's see if we can get it down to nothing. We can't get past the zeros, okay? So here's our zeros. We can't get past those. So here's our create LSNs of zeros. No matter whether they're used or not, these aren't used, and they're zeros, so I should have been able to shrink, but you can't. So past the zeros, you can't shrink. You have to rebuild the log, which you shouldn't have to do, and you shouldn't want to do. This isn't enough VLFs to scare you for just having those. But what I can do here in the DBA tools is I can actually come down here and say expand -DBA log file with a SQL instance of prod SQL1, and then say database is wide world importers DW, and I want my I could specify my log file if I have multiple log files, which you shouldn't have, but you could have them in some cases. I could specify my log file ID to say 3 or 4 or 5 or 7, whatever. But you don't have to specify it if it is 2. If it's the only log file and it's 2, because your log file will always be 2, if you create a new database, then your 2 would be your log file, and it knows that, so it's okay. What I want to do is I want to say, give me the target log size. Now this is in megabytes. So that means that if I want an 8 gig log, I say 8,000. That's my log target size. And then I have an increment size. Now, I will tell you that the messages you get here are for your purposes to just say, hey, you duck, you shouldn't have done that, right? But increment size, I could increment the size, and if I said 8,000, it would be 1 log growth, right? That's it, 1 log growth. But notice when I do 8, F8, it comes back and it'll expand it. See, it's going to expand it. Oop, it's still got 7,900 meg left to go, and it's only 1 log growth, right? It's 1 because I said 8,000 target, and I said 8,000 growth. It's going to do its best, and then we're going to end up with a 8 gig log file. But we'll see that in a second. Now it's done, and it tells me that my initial size was 100. My initial VLF count was 8, and my resulting is 7.81 gig, and my resulting is 24, which means it grew 16 times. And this is the database. So that's nice. The file ID was 2, and it's all nice. So now if I go back in here and I do a execute again, you'll see that I get 24 VLFs, and these are all the 16. They grew in 1 slot because this is the same. So your create LSN, if you look at that and tell how many there are, that's how many VLFs were created by your growth. But in this case, I have 493.75, and my database log is files 8,000, because I said the target size was 8,000. But what you can do here, here's the beauty. There is a point where this number gets big enough that when you grow the file by 512 meg, that it will actually grow 1 VLF of 512 meg. So now what you can do is you can come in here and you can say expand-dba log file, and I want the size to be 64 gig, and I want you to grow it by 512. Now we won't do this, but we could, in this case, get to the point where I don't want to use 64 gigs, so I'm not going to do this. But basically, it will let you grow this, and you walk away, and this will have a bar that says progress that basically lets you do as many as you want, and it will grow by 512 meg. You don't have to right-click on the database, do properties, go into files, change it by 512, do it again, do it again, do it again. You can just let this guy do it. Just rip it, and it will, however many it has to do to get to 64 gig, it will do 512 meg chunks. As like clockwork. It's beautiful. So all of a sudden, we have a way to grow our log file consistently without clicking your way to death. So this function I use a lot. And it works as expected. I mean, even if I were to put 1,000, it would grow them in 1,000 meg increments. Now, it didn't say how many VLFs do you want. It just said, how big do you want the log? How big do you want the growth? And I'll just grow it as many times as it takes to get you to that point, and happy days. And it will finish and tell you the same thing. Here's what your current size is. Here's how many VLFs you have. Here's what your previous size was, and here's how many VLFs you had before. And that's just a nice little thing to help you understand what's going on. But this is a function I wanted to illustrate just because it is very cut and dry, very simple. It will even shrink the log file for you. There's a parameter here that says shrink log file. And basically it will back up and shrink and back up and shrink and do its thing. And then shrink size, you can actually tell it you only want to shrink it to this size. So say you've grown your database to a certain like 64 gig and it auto grew. Well, the 64 gig is already in 512 meg chunks. So you could say shrink size is 64 gig and then continue from there. So it'd shrink it down to 64 gig if it could, if the status 2s aren't after the 64 gig. But if it was above 64 gig and it was approaching 64 gig and there was no 2s after, it would shrink the size to 64 gig and then proceed to add space to the log. So beautiful function. Wanted to make sure you saw that. I didn't see any questions come across in either place, so hopefully it was helpful. And if you have any questions, please feel free to go to pollgab.com in the DBADuck PowerShell or the DBADuck room and ask the question there, and we'll pick you up on the next All Ask Me Anything. Thank you very much, and happy PowerShelling.